Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for checking out another video. We are moving right along with our 996 Restomod / K24 how-to swap video series. In the last video, we installed the engine in the 996 and found out that the engine bay is slightly different and we needed to adjust our engine brace to lower the engine a little bit, and also suggested that you run the 997 suspension brace that goes underneath the engine. In the time between that video and now, I contacted my friend Randy over at DC Auto. They are a Porsche recycler. I've bought a bunch of used Porsche parts from them, and I asked Randy about this subframe brace, and apparently in 2002, they changed them to what we're gonna call the 997 style. So if you have a 2002 or newer, you should be okay. You will already have the 997 brace. If you have a car that's pre-2002, I recommend talking to Randy. He says they have a whole bunch of those suspension braces and they're about 50 bucks. I'll try to put their link in the video description so it's easy for you guys to find them and contact Randy if you need one. Additionally, a whole bunch has happened on the car since the last video now. I find it easier to shoot the videos out of order and then do the intro at the end, but I have the engine over here and I'll show you how we are addressing the difference for the 996 engine brace. So if you need a 996 engine brace where the engine has to be positioned slightly lower, the engine brace is essentially the same. All we do is add a little spacer. So we laser cut these little 1/4 inch spacers, we TIG weld them on, and that will lower the engine enough to get us the clearance we need in the top of the engine bay. If you're doing this swap on a 996, we'll have a 996 specific version of the engine brace. And if you have a 997, we'll have a 997 version of the engine brace. They're basically identical except for this little spacer to lower the engine down a little bit on the 996. Because I'm shooting this video after the fact, you'll notice that I already have a powder coated valve cover and engine brace installed. Shout out to my friend Owen, who owns ArcLight Metal Fabrication. Owen's business, ArcLight, is technically a laser cutting sign company, but they also do powder coating, and I convinced him to powder coat a couple items for me. And he did such a good job that I might try to convince him to do more if other people want to do it. We did this valve cover in a black wrinkle coat. It is a powder coat, and I'd never actually seen a black wrinkle coat powder coat before, and it came out so awesome. It's kind of like OEM Honda. And then we did our engine brace in a satin black finish, and it came out so nice. I can't wait to get this engine back in there and see how they look. But let me know what you guys think. Should we offer this as a service? I had not intended to offer powder coating because the logistics of it are just something I can't really handle, but Owen's shop is nice and close. But if you're interested in one of these parts, powder coated, reach out to me and I'm sure we can work something out. All right, so I believe that should bring you up to speed as to where we left off in the last video. In this video, we are gonna install the intercooler on this 996. We validated that it fits on the 996, and I also showed how to do the install. Additionally, we are prepping the engine bay for all the fluid connections, such as the coolant lines, the fuel lines, and power steering lines. So we've started prepping those. I'm gonna show you what's involved in prepping the engine bay for all those fluid connections. Additionally, because this is technically a development car to me, I needed to take this opportunity to do some testing on the cluster. So I'm going to include in this video a segment on the Link ECU and what we can do with the factory instrument cluster to keep the factory Porsche instrument cluster happy on this car. So all that being said, I think this video is gonna be kind of long, so we should probably get right into it. Okay, time to start test fitting our intercooler. We created this intercooler on my 997, and we want to make sure that it's gonna fit on the 996s the same as it does on a 997. We've already found out that the engine bay is just ever so slightly different on the 996, requiring us to change the engine brace a little bit. So we need to test fit this intercooler on this car to make sure there's no interference. What I'm mostly concerned about is the bumper, that we'll be able to bolt the bumper back on. The intercooler goes back here in this space where the rear muffler would have been. We have to remove this heat shielding, which is pretty straightforward, but we also need to make a hole. And if this car had been a turbo car, it would have come from the factory with a hole in the sheet metal already there for an intercooler pipe. So I don't feel too bad about making a hole there. So what I need to do is pull out the heat shielding that's there. We're gonna start making that hole, and then we're gonna start test fitting this intercooler. And then we'll put the bumper back on and make sure it fits the same as it did on the 997. Okay, with our heat shielding out of the way, we can mark where we need to cut. Basically, from this edge along this line, we want to mark at the 2-inch mark. So I got a little mark there. And then straight up vertical, we want to go 4 inches. So 4 inches, I made another little mark. I'm going to use a center punch so I can make my pilot hole. Next, I'm going to use a small diameter drill bit and drill my pilot hole. From here, we're going to make a 3-inch hole with a hole saw, and a 3-inch hole in there will give us the clearance that we need so we can run our charge pipe through into the engine bay. Okay, fairly easy to make this 3-inch hole for the intercooler. I have the intercooler right here. One thing I forgot to mention before I made the hole was there are some wires that are over here behind the hole. Just pull them up and tuck them out of the way so those wires don't get hit by the hole saw as it passes through the sheet metal. All right, so almost time to mount the intercooler. One thing before we get there is I want to show you how we actually physically mount the intercooler to the car. The intercooler has mounts like this on both sides. It gets bolted to the supports for the bumper, rebar, crash bar support. So what we do is we take out these 2 bolts and I supply the kit with 2 new bolts and spacers. So the intercooler can bolt in place on top of this bumper crash bar support. For mounting the other side of the intercooler, we also have another bracket similar to the but slightly bent and modified so that we can bolt it to the sheet metal along the back here. In order to bolt it to here, we drill holes and add riv nuts to the sheet metal so that we can mount the intercooler securely in place. But in order to do that, you have to mount the front part first. Then we can figure out where the holes need to be for the back, and we can drill those holes, install the rib nuts, and then the intercooler will be mounted very securely in this space. So why don't I start mounting the front, then we'll take care of the rear, and then we can see how this thing fits all said and done. So our intercooler comes with some bolts and some spacers to mount this intercooler. I've already removed the factory bolts. They're not long enough, so that's why we supply these with the spacer. I'll show you how these all install. It's much easier with 2 people, but I'm here by myself today, so let's see how I make out. All right, intercooler bolted on, and now we have to deal with the other side. Over here, we need to mark out where we want to make our holes for our riv nuts. So basically just hold the intercooler up so that the bottom bracket is flush with the sheet metal at the bottom. Then we're going to take a Sharpie, mark where our holes need to be. We'll drill some holes, and we will use a riv nut to add some threads so that we can bolt this intercooler to the sheet metal. If you're not familiar with the riv nut, I'm gonna go grab mine and show you what it's all about. All right, riv nut time. So this is my riv nut tool. I bought this one off Amazon. It was less than $100 for sure. I use this thing all the time. It is a great addition to your tool collection. If you can borrow one, great. If not, I would suggest buying one off Amazon because it is a really good addition to your tools. So what I have over here are riv nuts, and what they are is kind of like a rivet. Once compressed, it provides a means of threads for a bolt. This is the hardware for the bracket on the intercooler. We provide a spacer because there is a slight offset with where the sheet metal is, where the intercooler mounts, but I'm gonna make the holes and install these riv nuts, and then we'll finish mounting up this intercooler. All right, so make sure it's flush along the bottom. I'm just gonna make a little dot for the top hole and one for the bottom hole. Those look good. Now we have to remove the intercooler so we can drill these holes and install the riv nuts. been loaded up with one of the riv nuts. Basically, once it's loaded, you pull these two handles together, it squishes this piece just like a rivet, and you have a set of threads in sheet metal that you can mount stuff to. So I'll show you what it's like. And just like that, we have two perfect threaded holes in the sheet metal that we can mount our intercooler to. Now with these rib nuts installed, we can fully install the intercooler with both front and rear brackets and continue on. And then we can test fit the bumper to make sure it still fits with this intercooler in place. All right, with the intercooler bolted in place, we can now test fit the bumper cover. We're gonna reinstall the bumper cover, make sure it clears, make sure there's no interference with our intercooler. Fingers crossed that this is compact enough that it's not gonna interfere with the 996 bumper. So, success. The intercooler fits on this 996 the same as it does on a 997. That is great news. We do not have to redesign this intercooler specifically for the 996. That means we can continue on with this project and continue plugging away on this 996, which means we're gonna get this done much quicker because we don't have to spend any time redesigning this intercooler. So I'm pretty happy that that's not the case, and we can continue on with this swap. In this episode, the plan is to start making all the fluid connections from the chassis to this new engine, such as connecting the coolant system, the fuel system, the power steering lines, the air conditioning lines. So the plan is to drop this engine out and start making the alterations to the existing connections so that we can connect them to the K24 engine. One of the big things we're gonna work on is the cooling system. The existing Porsche cooling system is fantastic. It holds a lot of coolant and it has a ton of thermal capacity, plenty for this K24 turbo engine, but we do have to figure out a way to connect that existing cooling system to this new engine. So we do have to make some modifications. The existing connections are one on the passenger side and one on the driver's side. And on my car, what I did was I kind of cut these back so they would connect easier to the engine. And then I welded on some custom fittings. The plan is to offer those weld-on fittings that I used, but I have another idea how to approach this as well. The existing connections are basically just a bead-rolled 1.5-inch pipe. And my thought is if we cut these back to where they will allow us to connect to the engine, we can bead-roll them again, and then we can use a 1.5 to 1.25-inch transition or adapter to bring these pipes down to the 1.25-inch size that the K24 engine needs. And then we should be able to just connect everything with clamps. To do bead rolling, there's a few different ways. You can kind of do it manually. There's a bunch of different videos on YouTube on how to do it. Vibrant sells a really high quality bead roller. It is pretty pricey. There is a cheaper Amazon knockoff version. I have one of those. It does the job. It doesn't work great, but it is very reasonably priced, so it might be a worthwhile investment as a tool. I think we're gonna take that approach with this car, cut back these tubes, bead roll them, and see if we can connect them to the engine just as nicely as I did with the weld-on fittings. All right, engine is out. Engine bay is free and clear. With the engine out, I might as well take this opportunity to show you roughly where we're gonna be modifying the coolant lines. So there's a hard line on both sides of the engine bay. One on the driver's side here, one on the passenger side here. These hard lines connect the engine to the radiators up front. This one on the driver's side is what I consider the hot one, which is the coolant out of the engine. We connect the upper coolant housing to this hard line, and then this hard line we connect to the return or the thermostat inlet housing. So For these two lines, on this car, the way I think I'm gonna approach it, and it might change, but this is how we're gonna approach this 996 is, I'm gonna cut what we're calling the driver's side hard line here, and the passenger side hard line, basically right here. And we're gonna take these off then, and then bead roll them and connect them with some couplers, and then connect them to the engine. But first things first is we gotta remove these hard lines, modify them, and then get them back in place. While we're at it, we're gonna also address the fuel lines. The 996 has a fuel filter here kind of attached to the expansion tank. It's kind of in the way of the wastegate, and it's also just in a generally hot spot. So I think we're gonna relocate that fuel filter and remove all the factory fuel lines. The fuel lines connect kind of over here. So there's some fuel injection lines here. I believe this is the feed and this is the return. On my 997, which is over there, I just bought the fuel injection adapter fitting for this line and converted it to -8 from there, and then fed it directly to the fuel rail. The plan is to do basically the same thing on this car, but the difference being there is a feed and a return. So this is gonna feed the fuel rail, it's gonna go into the fuel rail, then it's gonna go into a regulator, and it's gonna come back and we'll reattach it at this point. I'll do my best to capture that as we take care of it. Additionally, we have to take care of the existing AC lines. The original AC lines terminate closer in the engine bay. We're gonna remove these AC lines and disconnect them at this point, because the AC line kit that we have created connects to the car's existing hard lines at this point. We don't need any of the existing hard lines that come this way. We couldn't connect to them properly anyways, so we're gonna remove those while the engine is out, just to make life easier. So that's basically what we have to take care of for now. We're gonna take care of all that, and then we'll show you once we're done. All right guys, so we have reinstalled the coolant hard lines that we cut back and bead rolled. I'm really liking this positioning, and I think this is gonna work really well, but like I said, things might change because this is a development car, and once we get the engine back in, we'll just determine if this is the best spot or not, which I do think it is. These look pretty good to me. I think it's gonna work out, but I will keep you posted on that. Additionally, we've started to map things out. So over here are the heater hose lines. These are the lines to feed the heater core in the dash, so you have heat in your car. On the right, we have the in or the hot side. On the left, we have the out or the cold, so basically return. As we dress the engine and get it back in the engine bay, I'll show you how we connect to these existing hard lines. Further along, we have the fuel lines. We have our feed line and the return line. The feed line, I've already temporarily installed one of the K-Tune's fuel injection to AN adapters. This is their 5/16 to -8 fuel injection adapter. It allows you to adapt a standard fuel injection line to an AN style fitting. So I have the -8 one on the feed side. I gotta pick up a -6 one for the return line because we're gonna go -8 to the fuel rail, and then we're gonna size it down to -6 for the return. But again, once we start dressing the engine and get it back in place, I'll show you how we run these fuel lines to this point. We've also removed the AC lines. The new ones are gonna connect to these existing points, like I said earlier. One last thing I guess we're gonna touch on is this hose up here. This guy is important. This is the vacuum source for your brake boosters. It provides the vacuum for your brake booster, gives you the power assist for your brake booster, so definitely gotta keep this guy. We're gonna be adding a vacuum manifold to this car, directly connected off the intake manifold to feed stuff like this fitting here and the blow-off valve and the reference for the wastegate. But again, as we get further along, I'll share how we take care of that as well. So far so good. The engine bay is basically all prepped as we need it so we can get the engine back in here. All right guys, moving right along with this 996 development, one of the things we need to tackle is the stock Porsche instrument cluster. We want to make the instrument cluster work just like OEM with our K-swap kit. On these 996s, it is very analog. What I mean by that is there are physical sensors specifically dedicated to driving the instrument cluster in the dash. Unlike our 997 kit, where we were able to utilize the CAN bus network to keep the instrument cluster happy, on this car, there are a whole bunch of proprietary Porsche sensors and connectors that we simply can't get or recreate or add to our K-Series swap. So what we need to do is utilize the standalone ECU that we're running to simulate some of those sensors and send those signals directly to the cluster, even though the original sensors aren't there. Luckily, we can do this because we've partnered with Link and used their standalone G4X Fury X ECU. This is a super powerful ECU and is super flexible. Because of that, we can use some of the outputs to drive the signals that we want to send. Usually you would use this ECU in a completely custom application, but what we've done is provided a conversion box that lets you plug this ECU into the factory Porsche wiring. And what we've done is created custom firmware, custom base maps to get these 911s to run with the K-Series using this ECU. So what I have is the 996, technically all apart, but it has the wiring harness installed. We're gonna install the Link ECU with the custom conversion harness. We're gonna power this car up and we're gonna connect to those wires for the instrument cluster, and we're gonna start testing out and figuring out how to make the stock cluster work using this Link G4X ECU. All right, I got everything connected. The car is powered up with a battery. I have my laptop in the car. I have the Link ECU connected to the wiring harness with our jumper box. The wire harness that I have installed in this car is sort of a development wire harness for the 996s. It has an additional breakout connector. Normally I would supply the harness with this connector, which has additional inputs and outputs, so you can do whatever you want, taking advantage of all the programmability of the Link ECU. But in this case, I have an additional one of these, and this connector has all the additional wires that go directly to the cluster that would have been connected to sensors in the engine bay. So for testing purposes, I'm using one of the outputs in my breakout connector and connecting it directly to the wiring that goes directly to the cluster. And then with this connection, I can jump on the laptop and start manipulating the outputs to try to simulate the original sensors on the cluster. So why don't I jump in the car and show you what I mean? All right, this is the 996 cluster. What I'm going to show you now is how I've simulated the needle sweeps on this cluster to simulate the coolant temperature sensor that was in the engine and also the oil pressure sensor that was on the original Porsche engine. So first up is the coolant temperature sensor. I'm going to use the Link software and programmable output to manipulate that needle there and simulate the original Porsche sensor that was on the engine that is not there at the moment. All right, what I'm using is one of the general purpose pulse width outputs that these ECUs provide. And I've already gone through and figured out the mapping of this, and I'm just gonna show you how it works because you do not need to do this. I've already taken care of it, but I thought it'd be kind of cool to show you what we can do with this ECU, basically recreate whatever we need to keep these cars happy. So when the swap is all said and done, we'll be using the Honda coolant temperature sensor. I'll provide a base map with the mapping of this gauge so that the gauge moves in sync with what the Honda coolant temperature sensor is outputting to the ECU. So right now I have it outputting to basically cold, and I can change the value on this table over here and we will start moving this needle. So I'm gonna move it up to the first tick mark on this gauge. These needles swing pretty slowly, so I'll show you what I mean. So I'm gonna input the value to make it go to the first tick mark, and we'll see how slow it goes. So it slowly makes its way to the first tick mark, and then it'll stop there, and then we can send it to, let's send it to 180. So sending it to 180 now. And we can send it to what I'm going to call maybe 200. So I'll move up to that middle tick mark there, sort of. And then ultimately, if it's overheating, if we want to warn that it's really overheating, we send it all the way to the top, and that can be specified with at whatever temperature we want. Like realistically, on a K-Series, if you're getting over 220, I think I'll set it so that it does this. So that's how we're gonna make the coolant temperature gauge work. The additional gauge we need to make work is the oil pressure sensor gauge. Right now, because it's disconnected, it defaults to reading high. I'm gonna go change up the wiring, and I'll show you how we can manipulate this oil pressure gauge just the same as we did with the coolant temperature. All right, so I've changed up the connection in the engine bay. Now we're working on the oil pressure gauge there, and I have it set so it's gonna read 0 now. So let's move it to number 1. All right, so there it's moving up to number 1. We can move it up to number 2. Number 2, we can move it up to number 3. We can move it up to number 4. We can move it up to number 5. And there we have it. So we're able to simulate the gauge needle sweeps simply with one of the Link's general purpose outputs and mapping it all out. So I've mapped it all out. It's gonna be included in the base map that we provide so that it keeps the cluster happy. And that's a big question. Everyone wants to know if this cluster is gonna be happy when you do this engine swap. We're doing our best to make sure everything stays happy. So let me know what you guys think. I think this is pretty cool. I very rarely get a chance to work on things like this, and I find this stuff fascinating and fun to do. So yeah, I think that's about it for this segment. Why don't we move on to the next? All right guys, so I think we're gonna end the video there. In the next video, the plan is to fully dress this engine and get it back in the engine bay. And by fully dressing it, I mean make all the alterations, all the preparations that are required to make this engine work in the Porsche engine bay. So we will make all the coolant connections, the fuel connections, install the wiring harness, also take care of the plumbing needed for the turbo system, the oil feed line, the coolant lines, show you how to take care of all that stuff. Additionally, we have to finish the install of this valve cover. Because this is an ultra low profile valve cover and we are using different ignition coils, we're no longer using K-series ignition coils because they are too tall. We are using Honda J-series V6 ignition coils because they are a little bit shorter and gave us that little bit of extra clearance that we needed in the engine bay. But because they are shorter, the spark plug tubes have to be cut down. So I've already cut down 2 of the spark plug tubes on this engine, so you can kind of see what I mean. It is a very simple process, but I've left 2 so that I can do these 2 on the next video and show you guys how to prep the engine and the spark plug tubes when you go to install one of these low profile valve covers. One of the other things I wanted to mention before closing out this video is the turbo. We are going to be using a Pulsar turbo this time around. On my original car, we used a Garrett G35 900. It's basically one of the best turbos money can buy. But that being said, it is also a very expensive turbo. These Pulsar turbos are a great economical alternative. I've tuned countless cars with Pulsar turbos and they perform really well. I'm also a dealer, so they give me a really good deal on turbos. And my plan is to actually do a little comparison dyno tuning testing with these 2 specific turbos. This turbo here on the left is a 5855, so a 770 horsepower rated turbo. The turbo on the right is a 6262 turbo, which is rated for 900 horsepower, very similar to the G35 900 that is on my car. Because they're basically the same footprint, I should be able to swap them out and not have to make any alterations to the charge piping or the exhaust system, so that I can basically change these out and see how they perform compared to each other. This 5855 I know will spool really early, but it might hold me back power-wise. This 6262 will spool probably a bit later, but can ultimately make more power. But I'll be able to use my dyno to find out what exactly the spool difference is and ultimately what the power level difference is at different PSIs. I really enjoy making comparison videos, and this is one that I'm really looking forward to. It's not easy making comparison videos, but luckily because these 2 turbos are very similar in size, it should be fairly easy to swap them around when the time comes. But let me know what you think of the video series so far. I hope to get the next one out very soon. I'm eager to get this car up and running. But anyways, I think that is it for this video, guys. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you again in the next one. Bye now.